Good morning, good noon, good afternoon, depending on where you're coming in from today. As I'm looking at the list of names, I see some familiar names and faces, and some people really new to this community. So I want to welcome everyone, and I'm sure there'll be people coming in for the first few minutes anyway as people get settled. But just a quick introduction: I'm Hunt Priest, and I'm the director of Ligare, and not the convener of all the conversations, but the convener of kind of the larger group. And today we're going to be doing exactly what Ligare is intended to do, which is to provide resources for people around at the intersection of religion and Christianity, spirituality and psychedelics, and to gather community and to help all of us find the other people who are interested in this work. So these events and gatherings are intended for that. Feel free to use the chat. In fact, if you would just quickly just drop in where you're zooming in from. That's one way to orient us to see where it's often helps to see that somebody else is down the road or up the road or in the next town or on the same continent in some cases. So just to help all of us kind of see where everyone is helpful. I'm going to turn it over to my friend Tim King in just a minute. But again, just want to welcome everyone and let you know that this is exactly what we exist for, is just to gather people and make connections. So been working with Tim. In fact, I've been working with everyone on this panel almost from the beginning in different ways. I met Aize very early in my work. Seth was in the Johns Hopkins NYU study with me. We met pretty early on, and then Tim King was was really one of the first people I began to work with on this. He came on board very early, helping me get started and helping us think about program and organizational work. So Tim's been a colleague from the very beginning, as have some of you are on the call. So I want to now turn it over to Tim, who's been convening these and organizing and imagining these particular gatherings. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Hunt, and welcome everybody. And always great to see folks come together for these conversations. This is something we piloted a little bit this year and are going to turn into a regular, pretty much every month of 2024, to have these more in-depth conversations with different thinkers and artists in this space. And so one thing that would be great is we're planning out, we've got a couple of months into 2024 already planned out, some great conversations coming up. Anything from environmental issues and the intersection of psychedelics to problems and possibilities with peak experiences. And so one thing that would be great is we are always interested in engaging more folks. One of the great things has always been the quality of the people who join these calls. And so if you have ideas for topics, if you've got ideas for people, if you've got ideas for stuff we could be reading together, please go ahead and fill out. There's a short Google form. And yes, feel free to even nominate yourself. We're looking forward to engaging with folks and putting together a robust 2024 calendar for these discussion groups. And for today, we've got two great folks who, as Hunt said, have been with and engaged with Ligare for quite some time. First, Aize Jama Everett graduated from the Graduate Theological Union in 2001 with a Master's of Divinity. Thesis was on the spiritual use of substances among the homeless youth of Morocco, London, and the Bay Area. Soon after, he began teaching the course, The Sacred and the Substance, one of the first survey courses of sacred plant use at the Graduate Theological Union. Thesis advisor was the late Ibrahim Farajay Jones, who also served as his mentor. He received training from the Zen Hospice Center of San Francisco, harm reduction training from the Harm Reduction Coalition of Oakland, and he has helped design the facilitation training with the Sacred Garden community of Oakland. And he is a filmmaker, and hopefully you get a chance to watch a few of his clips from his new film, A Table of Our Own, and we'll be sure to ask him and keep you updated on some opportunities for you to see that film in its entirety soon. We also have Seth Jones, who was a participant in the Johns Hopkins NYU Religious Professional Study in late 2018 and early 2019, while he was the pastor of a congregational church on the coast of Maine. The experiences he had in the study influenced Seth's desire to get a Doctor of Ministry, which he completed in May of 2022. Focus for his doctoral work was extraordinary spiritual experiences. Hopefully some of you have gotten a chance to read part of his thesis. And he discerned and explored ways of mapping these extraordinary spiritual experiences that allow for integration for the experience and understanding for those who encounter such experiences, either in their own lives or when they hear of them from others. He's currently writing a book based on his experiences and his doctoral dissertation. And the theme of this call and discussion today is that a lot of the coverage we see around psychedelics is around individual experiences and their therapeutic benefits. And often how people tell their stories about engagement with psychedelics is their peak experience, their extraordinary spiritual experience that is often framed as something individual. But we know that a lot of the traditions that have held this plant medicine wisdom have seen this as a communal experience and for the purpose of building community. So Seth and Aize, based on Seth's doctoral dissertation and then Aize's film and his own teaching, are going to engage in a discussion for us about how these inform each other and are held in tensions, as well as some places of danger or critique. And once they have this initial conversation with each other, just so you know, the rest of the format is we'll be breaking into some Zoom rooms where we'll be able to have conversations with each other. Then as that comes to an end, everyone will be able to come back and have some time for either comments on some of the conversations that came up in your Zoom rooms or additional questions for Aize and Seth. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aize and Seth to begin the conversation. And Aize, I'll turn it over to you first.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Just so you know, of course, when you're ready to talk to some people, you get a cold like the night before. So if I sound a little froggy, I hope you can forgive me. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you just like thumbs up if you can? Awesome. Seth, so happy to be in conversation with you again. Done the
You
daunting.
too.
You've put the hard thoughts down on paper.
Well,
And I guess I wonder, between the time, you wrote this chapter and now, have your views changed on, the ESEs, as you call them, or the role of community or group within ESEs, or is it still pretty much the same?
I would say it's pretty much the same, and if anything, it's gotten stronger over time. You know, my first of all, thank you as well. Thank you, Aize and Hunt and Tim and everyone involved here. These are great, and I really enjoy being involved with Ligare. But my sense of it has gotten even stronger. I was talking about this with someone else the other day, and just generally speaking, I believe we only really truly make meaning when we're with other people, and most particularly our extraordinary spiritual experiences only really begin to make sense when they're shared with others. And there's a lot of components to that, and I consider the extraordinary spiritual experience to be a long-term event. And what I mean by that is that you have the actual experience, whether it's spontaneous, like like Mary's visitation from the angel Gabriel, or facilitated, like many of us are involved here because of psychedelics. That would be a facilitated extraordinary spiritual experience. And either way, there's the event itself, there's the preparation for the event, there's the meaning you've made from what's happened, and then there's what we share with other people. And it's in that sharing with other people that true meaning gets made.
Can I
And
push back? Can I push
yeah,
back just a little bit?
yeah,
Because I think there's that one element you say, like, there's the meaning that you make, and then there's I think you call it the disclosure,
yeah,
right?
right.
And I think in the traditions that I have been in, typically African American, US, Caribbean based,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of the experience and the disclosure tend to happen at the same time
Right, right.
in like intimate community. And I think
Mhm.
one of the differences maybe from the medical model, but then also as I was rereading, I was like, well, the examples that you used were one-on-one disclosures, right?
Yeah.
And I think I come from a tradition that calls, I mean, I think in the Christian tradition, it would be called testifying, right? Like you're everyone now, you know, all at once, like this is what this is. But I've also been in a lot of medicine communities where what someone was working with was was told to everyone as they were working with it. So it wasn't like one person was having a journey. Everyone was having a journey because everyone in some way was a part of it. You know, so I
Yeah.
wonder if there's room in your theory of like not collapsing three or four, but maybe like massaging them together.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. My experience has been, uh, well, this isn't quite right, but no, I absolutely agree with that. And I think it's a great expansion, correction, uh, redirect, however you want to call it. Uh, I think that's really key and really important because as you and I talked before, you know, the the history of psychedelics, uh, it seems to me this is the time we're in now is unusual. The one-on-one medicalized focus on the singular experience. For the history of psychedelics, it's been exactly what you just said. This communal experience shared together, so that uh, it could even be that your psychedelic experience that you have, whether in the group or on your own, has no meaning to you as an individual, but when you share it with others, it has meaning for other people in the group. In other words, your trip may not have been for you, it may have been for somebody else. And I think that's really, really hard for Westerners to hear. So,
Absolutely. I mean, one of my many hats is in teaching this class, but I'm also a trained, you know, psychotherapist. And so we have this understanding of the mind coming from, at least in the US, you know, from a Freudian standpoint, at least initially, and then, you know, expanding out.
mhm,
But, you know, 1600s, 1700s Iroquois communities, dreams, and I'm using dreams here because
sure.
their dream is expansive, could also include psychedelic work as we define it. But your dreams were meant to be interpreted by the community.
Yes.
You know, like
Yeah.
you held the dream, sure, but the understanding of the dream was not necessarily yours to hold,
hmm
right?
Right.
And this is like, you know, 150, 200 years before Freud, right? Like that this
hmm
group dream interpretation. So I think when we're talking about journey work, I think it's really important to think about what are the networks of, I forgot what you called them. You called them like um communities of interest.
Oh,
Uh,
yes. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
like who's the community of interest in this journey? Again,
hmm
I'll say, you know, again, beating on that African American drum of mine. Um, there's well, not just African Americans, women too. Like there's communities of interest, right? There's a lot of people that are
Yeah.
interested, but then there's also communities of trust.
hmm
Not everybody
Absolutely.
is like trustworthy, and I know a lot of women have that experience as well. Of like,
Yeah.
especially in the psychedelic space, of like, you know, who are the community that you can really rely on to interpret, to hold, to vision with,
hmm
right? Um, I think we reduce in the psychedelic space, we reduce the beauty and the splendor that can be community and holding and healing to set and setting, right?
Yep.
We're like, we're
Yes.
so focused on this like peak experience, blah, 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 blah. We just almost dismiss all the things that can make these peak experiences life-changing events with
hmm
set and setting. It's just set and setting. You just got to get that under control. I'm
Yeah. Right. Right.
like I thought that was the whole thing, you know?
Yeah. The set and setting piece. My experience at Johns Hopkins, which is quite the controlled set and setting. Um, it seems to me that you can do all the things, and then you're just spinning the wheel of fortune once the substance hits. You don't know really where things are going to go. Um, in that the set and setting in that discussion sort of brings me to one of the questions, thoughts for you, Aize, is in your film, A Table of One's Own, in the excellent previews on your website, it's very clear, and there's several organizations doing this. It's very clear that there's concern in the psychedelic world how our communities operate, and it's very easy for a white community to just operate as if psychedelics are great, they bring in love and harmony and peace, and that can actually be a colonizing attitude in these spaces. And so what I'm becoming increasingly aware of is the importance of communities that are not white communities being able to have their own cultural experience around these things. And so, yeah, I wanted to bring that in and have you talk a little bit about the importance and the value of that, especially in relationship to the community aspect of all this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, I joke and say I've been underground all my life, but for most of my experience, I've been working in the underground, and I live in Oakland, and so the people that I've worked with have been African American, Afro Caribbean, Latino, Hmong, white, Asian, like this broad spectrum of people.
Mhm.
But when I became like above ground, it it was just so white culturally dominant. And it was confusing because I was like, oh, it's not like white people are the only ones doing this. And in fact, there's an argument that like there was a disconnection from these traditions in European cultures because of their disrespect to their wise women, to the witches. So I'm
Yeah,
like, so
yeah.
how did this happen? Like it was just so confusing to me. And then I would get in trouble. I mean, I don't work with Sacred Garden anymore. I don't really support them. But I remember I was doing a talk at UC Berkeley for as a representative of Sacred Garden. And I made a joke. I was like, listen, I hate the Grateful Dead. I think Fish sucks. How come I had to go to a Grateful Dead parking lot to get my first, bag of mushrooms? And someone got real upset with me. They were like, how could you say that about the Grateful Dead? As though to like not appreciate the dead was to not appreciate, sacred plant culture. And I was like, we have to disentangle these things.
Yeah.
Like you can have white hippie culture, whatever. And like there's some white hippies that I really appreciate. But to say that that is, sacred plant medicine culture, like that represents all of it.
Hmm.
Well, what you end up doing is you then filter a lot of people out. It's like if you like when we did the documentary, I was like, I want this documentary to appeal to Black hippies, to Black jocks, to Black tech workers, to Black artists. I wanted it to appeal to everyone.
Hmm.
Like, because plants are for everyone, right? Sacred
Yeah,
medicine
right.
is like should be available and accessible to everyone. But when we start putting our own cultural boundaries on these traditions, well, then it's just another clique. It's just another fad. What we miss out on, as what you wrote about so brilliantly, is that broad community that can help us make meaning of our experiences.
Yeah.
You know, I was leading a journey with a crew of Black people, and I put on some John Coltrane, and they were like, "Oh my God, I've never heard John Coltrane in a journey before." I was
Oh,
like, "What do you
cool.
mean?" Well, it was always sound bowls or like Tibetan throat singing, or it was like all this other, like,
Yeah,
nothing wrong with those things. I like those things
sure.
too, but like, John Coltrane was tapped in on some serious stuff, and like that music is there for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds great, actually.
I wanted to ask you a question. And I mean, I still think it's on topic, but like, I'm thinking about like in a specifically Christian tradition, right? And we're looking at like psychedelics and this like this peak experience, right? Like I think everybody's, and you use this word a lot, and like the editor in me was like, you kept saying things were weird, and I was like, well,
Oh,
tell me more. Weird, what do you mean by weird? But
mhm,
I think there's a correlation between the peak experience and something miraculous,
mhm, mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And something other ordinary appearing in the ordinary world, right?
Mhm,
And so, with Christians who engage in psychedelics, who are thinking about this work, I wonder, like, is the appeal of this work the opportunity to encounter the miraculous, or is it to help live a more Jesus-like life?
mhm.
So, like, the way I was thinking about it was like, the disciples, were they following Jesus because he turned water into wine and walked on water and
Right,
resurrected
right.
Lazarus? Or did they follow because they believed in the prophecy of what's to come in the next world and this?
Yeah.
So I wonder if you hear any of those correlations or similarities or not.
Yeah, to address the second part first, my impression uh is, well, first of all, Christianity, just as a religion, um, is is a religion built on the extraordinary spiritual experience, the resurrection, uh, you know, the the trans I want to say
Substantiation.
yeah, the transmogrification, that when he's on top of the mountain. Yes, transfiguration, thank you. Um, these are all extraordinary experiences, uh, all of which the disciples witnessed. And so, how do we think about those? Are they confirming of the authority of Jesus and all of that? This is a good time to talk about that, coming up to Christmas and all. Uh, but it seems to me that either the for anyone, people don't, in my mind, having been a pastor for 15 years, people don't follow a religion. They don't adopt religious ideas just because they're good ideas. There's some experience that anchors us to whatever belief structure we've chosen. And that experience often is extraordinary. There's something that bends us out of our ordinary lives. And so this gets to, my repeated use of the word weird. And when I think of the weird, I think of things that uh, slide us off, bend us away from, uh, deviate from our understood perceptions of how reality is supposed to work. And so things deviate. People aren't supposed to walk on water. People aren't supposed to resurrect. People, don't heal other people by just touching them. And so things bend strange. And when you walk out into the world after that experience, everything looks different. You have to reframe, you have to remap everything in order to accommodate this new reality that's presented itself. And so that's kind of what I mean by weird. And I don't know, does that answer the question you were asking there?
It does, and then it offers like about five others.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, it just because again, like I come out of African traditional religions,
Yeah.
and like you know you're sick and you're ill, you go to Sangoma, and the Sangoma says his prayers and does his things and makes you bury some cat bones underneath a tree somewhere, and then boom, you're better, right? Like, and it's miraculous or whatever, like there are stories of, people's powers and people's healing and people's, amazing things that they're able to do. And these are, and I think one of the legacies of African traditional religions is that there is a lot less separation between sacred time and sacred space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like it's, I remember being in Ethiopia, and someone was showing me the seat that was it was a seat of a Ethiopian priest in Lake Gondar, and it was like they're amazing. They're like, he sat on this for 30 years. He like meditated on it for a year. Entirely, it's filled with spiritual power. And da da da. And I was like, oh, this is dope. And then they're like, oh, do you want a Coke? And I was like, yeah. And they used the seat to open up the Coke.
Oh, wow.
Like,
Yeah.
like this preciousness of like this sacred, like
Yeah.
this has to be put away. They don't have that.
Right.
And
There's no separation between them. Yeah.
yeah. And so I wonder how much of that weirdness, right? Again, goes to culture in a specific space, as opposed to a theological divide. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Right. No, I hear what you're saying there, and I think that's well said. I am, yeah, people who live in that where it's just part of their natural understanding. Is anything weird? No, what would be weird for them is the culture I'm a part of. That's what would be weird. And it wouldn't be weird in the good way we're talking about here. It would be.
But that's been exploited, right? Like that weird has been exploited as like, oh, this is something revelatory and new.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's kind of what's going on in psychedelic space right now, right? That like this is new. You're gonna like confront your shadow self and like, and my joke is always like, no woman who's been working in corporate America for over 25 years needs to confront her shadow self anymore. She just has to deal with it. Like, all of our terms and all of our like, these peak 5 experiences where we have ego death, we're like, no child of color that survived public schools in the US needs any more ego death. Like, we're good.
Yeah.
So we have these narratives about what psychedelics do, but they are all framed in this white Western male perspective as to what is good.
That's right.
And what we're aiming for. And I think like when the movement as a whole starts incorporating more women, especially more women at the age of 50, more people of color, right? Not just as participants, but as thought leaders, then we start having some really interesting conversations that are more connected with the conversation.
I really agree with that. And when I was done with my Johns Hopkins experience, so my second trip with them was in January of 2019. I started doing a lot of research into psychedelics and was kind of blown away at how, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but it's probably a good thing I was surprised, just how dominated by white men the whole thing was, including the study we were in. And I would also add, and it was only a few years before I went through that Johns Hopkins was like, oh, maybe we should start paying attention to, other groups of people when we do these things. But one of the things I really began to become aware of was the unconscious colonization of the psychedelic space, the places we actually go to in these journeys, and I felt for a long time like Western white patriarchal things were just doing another invasion of that space to pull it down and in and claim it and use it as a resource, another resource to just burn up and so I really resonate with what you're saying there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I was first coming above ground, I sort of had this like, I don't know if however much I fully adopted it, but I was thinking like it would be good to get more people of color into the psychedelic space.
Hmm.
And now I don't know if that's a good idea
Mm.
because I don't know if there's enough safe spaces for people of, I mean, there's the spaces that we create for ourselves always,
Yeah.
right? But like these broader institutions, these broader training programs, these broader like, SITs, um, for me, I was dumbfounded when Elijah McClain, because you don't know it, young, uh, unique thinking Black man who played violin was stopped by the police, held down, given a lethal amount of ketamine,
Mm.
and died.
Hmm.
I was astounded by the silence from ketamine from ketamine clinics and communities throughout the psychedelic space. I'm continually astounded, right? Like even on a practical level, the misuse of ketamine should have been something that folks could have, said, hey, this is not cool. This is something that can be used in a way that's like therapeutic and awesome. Why are you using it to sedate people in the street? But nothing,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And so, and that's just a public example of some of the, more private stuff that I've heard where I'm just like, there's really not a lot of attention paid to our safety and our lives. So often, when people are talking to me about like going to SITs and going to journeys or whatever, I'm like, who are the other people of color that are going to be there? Like, do they have your back? And
Hmm.
I mean, I know I keep harping on the same thing, but I say the same thing to women. There's a lot of sexual abuse. There's a lot of sexual
Yeah.
predation that's going on in the psychedelic space that we're
Hmm.
not talking about, that we're not giving people like safety on. I mean, when I sit with, I used to just do this with women, but I do this with everyone now. But when I sit with people, I say, look, there's all different types of journeys. There are some journeys that totally welcome sexual energy and sexual healing. That's not my work. That's not what I do. If that's what you want, please let me know, and I'll refer you to someone who does that. But if you ever feel any sexual tension, conflict with me, please let me know. I'll claim that as my fault, and I'll look to address it.
Hmm.
And I've had so many women be like, no one has ever said this to me before. And I've done like 7, 8, 9 different journeys with people, mostly men. And I'm like, what are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, how are we taking care of our folks? How are we building beloved community if we're not really loving our communities, like if
Right.
we're not
Right.
taking care of each other?
Yeah. And it's such a vulnerable space. I mean, how do you, you know, and I think, faith communities are vulnerable spaces as well, easily manipulated. And, people of power who desire power are gravitate towards those spaces in order to take power. And it's very difficult to protect, especially in such a vulnerable, open space as the psychedelic space. And we have to figure it out. I mean, you know, the last time uh, psychedelics got taken down was just because they were a threat to the power structure, the government. This
Yeah.
time it's a threat, you know, to vulnerable people. And we're going to have to figure it out. Or
And I'll say, I know we're gonna have to cut in a second, but I'll say I think it's really important we figure out in a good way, because part of the power that we have in these psychedelic spaces is that we get to be vulnerable.
Yep, right.
So it's like, how do we figure out, how do we allow ourselves, how do we allow each other to be vulnerable, and how do we give each other those spaces, and how do we protect those spaces for all of us so
Hmm.
that you can experience my vulnerability, I can experience yours, and no one is being harmed like in that experience. And I think
Right.
in a capitalist structure where we're taught not to exchange, not to share, but to, have a value transaction, it's really hard to think in that way,
It
you
is.
know.
And in a Christian context, you just made me think of this. Uh, Paul talks about it in relationship to marriage, where he calls it mutual submission. But I like the retranslation of mutual vulnerability. I think that's a really good, where all the power structures just get eliminated in the relationship. And you're not functioning in that way of thinking at all anymore. So, yeah.
Well, thank you both, and so much gold already in this conversation. And want to be sure everybody gets a time to connect with each other. So we're going to switch over into the Zoom rooms right now. And I want you to, I'm not insulted by what you said about the Grateful Dead. It's all right.
Glad we can still hang out.
Yeah. Never got to see them anyways. All right, but we're going to break everybody out into rooms. Feel free to pick up on any of those themes that were brought up in this conversation so far. We'll be coming back. You'll get a little signal with a 1-minute warning, just a little bit after 1. So see you all soon. Let's make sure. Oh, there we go. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Are we supposed to come back here or no?
I'm fascinated to hear about some of your story, Alexandra.
Well, I told Hunt I'm like the inverse of everybody else here, probably. You know what I mean? It's like the Christians trying to experiment with psychedelics, and then the people who have used psychedelics experimenting with Christianity. Two different things, right?
I was actually on a harm reduction policy call once recently, and somebody do some work with a group clergy for a new drug policy, and we were talking about harm reduction bills, and then someone talked about a psychedelic study committee for the Minnesota state legislature, and I was like, oh yeah, we'd be glad to support that. And he's like, a clergy group would? Then he looks at my Zoom background, and I had a San Pedro cactus, and he goes, can we talk? And we ended up chatting later about faith and everything. And then 2 months later, he emails me and he goes, I actually went back to church for the first time in 20 years. He goes, I just thought no one out there would talk with me, but I've been missing container, community, tradition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good chance to get a chance to talk and connect. I'm going to go ahead and highlight Aize and Seth again. And please do use the little arm. You've got your reactions. You can raise your hand to ask a question. And I'm going to get us started and ask Seth and Aize the first question, but please do queue up or drop it in the chat, and then I'll spotlight your video as well, and you can ask your question or make your comment. So Aize and Seth, one thing that I was wondering about is in interpreting journey experiences in community, what kind of tensions might you come up with people with different fundamental theological assumptions or religious traditions? And how would we help avoid situations or create a container where you aren't imposing your belief system onto another person's experience in a way that isn't fair or it could be harmful to them?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Want to take it, Aize? Go ahead.
I'll start, but you gotta come in after me.
Yeah, I will.
I mean, we talked about this a little bit before. I think there's a Zuni saying that I love, which I did not understand when I was a young person. And in the language that it was told to me, it said, no man can tell another man what to do. And I was like, of course they can. What are you talking about? And then they're like, no, like, if you do it, that's your decision. Like, you made that decision. But like, nobody else can make you do something else. There is a complicity that's involved. But so what happens in Zuni community sometimes when people are having a discussion, they're very it's like you want to go, it's like, yeah, there's no milk. And somebody will be like, going to the store to get milk would be smart. Yeah. Wonder whose car has enough gas to go to the store. Bobby's car had half, and it's like, it takes the longest time to figure out, like, right? Whereas we're used to be like, just go to the store, just go get the milk, right? And I think there's a skill in learning how to sit in community, which is knowing that, like, you could be wrong, right? Like, that you may not have the best answer, so that what you offer is always a suggestion. It's always tinged with humility. I love the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox like prayers, like when the priests are doing prayers and they say, Lord, please forgive me, greatest of all your sinners. And it's like, you're not the greatest of all sinners, you know that. But there's a built-in humility in there to say, like, I know that, like, I am not to be listened to 110%, right? And that's okay. So I think being in community like that, I think, like, by it's not just the person learning how to listen, it's learning how to speak in that space, which is not the way you would speak, I think, in normal capitalist everyday society.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, humility, and then really everyone in the community, I think, and this is incumbent on a leader to generate this, is to develop some comfort and tolerance of ambiguity, because especially with these experiences, they happen in liminal spaces, in these unknown floating spaces between the known and the unknown. And when you're in there, as Aize was just saying, there's a lot we don't know. The amount we don't know is far greater than what we know. And to just reduce everything to the known eliminates the extraordinariness of the experience. And so really developing a taste for liminality, ambiguity, and sort of helping people get comfortable with that space, so that we don't have to rely on certainty to interpret and understand an experience.
It's great, and feel free to raise folks' hands. If not, I'm going to keep asking these two some questions. And as soon as you talked about ambiguity and liminality, I was thinking about your riffing on Theodore Ogden, and the ways that how we do theology can create space for that. And also thinking back to the early church father Origen, and starting with, he's like, all right, with scripture, we're starting with the idea that there's at least 3 meanings, and we're not going to stop there. So I was wondering if you could riff on Theodore Ogden for us a little more, Aize.
Sure. Ogden's one of those psychoanalysts. He's the psychoanalysis that psychoanalysts love to hate. Because a lot of what he does is let go of theory. I call it the Orthodox Committee, but it's like, let go of the Freud, the Adler, the whatever, and just be in the room with the other person. And the idea is that there is a revelry that comes upon us when we are fully present with another person, to allow their conscious and their unconscious to impact us. And we let our unconscious and unconscious to impact them. And what's left is what Ogden calls this sort of analytic third. As a theologian and a therapist, I think it would be a fair translation to also call it maybe the Holy Spirit. For wherever two of you gather, there I am. It's like, if we're truly gathered, if we're truly in community, there is something larger than us that connects us and can actually give us wisdom and give us space. But in order to do that, kind of, what Seth was saying, we have to let go of our certainty. We have to let go of our theory and our knowledge and just really be in the moment. And that requires practice, right? I hold on to my security blankets when I'm in conversation with folks. To drop deep, I have to let some of that security go and just be. And I think that's a really important lesson when it comes to psychedelics, right? And especially because there'll be people who are demanding, wanting answers, right? Wanting a resolve, right? Like, I came to this journey for this, so where is my thing? Well, you may not get that. You may come for Coke and you ended up getting Doritos. Doesn't mean the Doritos aren't good. It just means it's not Coke, right? Can you be open enough for that, to receive that? Rick, I think your hand's up.
Yes, thank you. I had a response about the function of the community in terms of relationship to the individual psychedelic experience. For me, at least, I find it helpful to the normal posture in that in that relationship is one of critique. And I find it helpful to move from the position of critique to the position or posture of expanding. So the community is seen as a means of expanding the experience of the individual as opposed to critiquing negatively the experience of the individual. And then I wanted to ask you, this is really off the wall, but in your work with Caribbean persons and cultures, have you done anything with the Santeria?
Oh yeah.
And have you, and do they, is the prolific use of psychedelic substances and Santeria's worship?
I say in Santeria, Candomblé, Vodun, the altered states of consciousness are required to be connected to the divine. Every deity has its own colors, its own food, its own plants, and its own medicine, its own spirit, ashe, if you will, right? So, how we get to that altered state of consciousness, I'm not going to speak to different houses' approaches to those altered states of consciousness, but I think it's a fair assumption to say that like altered states of consciousness are there. I mean, I've seen people juggle fire. Do you know what I mean? Like I've seen, for those of you that are unfamiliar, part of these African traditional religions is that people, the spirits, the gods take over people's bodies, and speak through them and do, kind of what I was talking about before, Seth, like miracles to prove that they are in those bodies in order to be a good mount, a good vessel for these spirits. You have to be in an altered state of consciousness. Anthropologists have collapsed the fact that people are in an altered state of consciousness to say that's why they can do all these things. But from inside the traditions of Santeria, Vodun, whatever, they say, no, it's just a prerequisite. So that's why sometimes children will have, the spirits will mount children and they're like, whoa, the kid's not even part of the ceremony. But because they're so open, because kids are, always in an altered state of consciousness, as far as I'm concerned, right? Like they will exhibit some of those experiences of the deity. So yeah, I think there's definitely strong indications that there are psychedelic use in Santeria.
Yeah, and I have talking about children. I have experienced somewhat of the same thing with people who are, what's the gentle way to say this? I grew up with a sister who was Down syndrome, and her relationship to the divine was much more immediate than mine.
Less filters again.
Yeah.
Look at Doug Lyman.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to dig a little deeper. You made some wonderful comments at the beginning about, because those of us who are really in a predominantly white kind of psychedelic culture, are there any other tips you can offer and suggestions about how we make our space more inclusive to allow people of different backgrounds to feel welcome and encouraged and open? What do we? You gave some good examples at the beginning. What are we getting wrong and what are we getting right, and what's the way forward that you think we could, those of us could embody a little bit better on the white side?
I mean, I don't have a full answer. It's because it hasn't been like where my mind has been. But like, I think the first question would be like, why do you want like people of color in your sit? Like, what is the motivation in that? I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but like to be clean in that, right? To be clean in your intention, right? And then like to have an accurate assessment of yourself, like what's my skill set when it comes to fill in the blank, like how many fill in the blank people do I know, period? What do I know of that culture? What do I know of those traditions, right? And how flexible are you, right? It may mean that like the way that you generally do your medicine, you may have to do differently. It may mean that like you have some unconscious stuff that you need to look at that you haven't, you know, checked in on with yourself about. I think it's a lot of work personally. And like, that's why half the time I'm like, why would you do that to yourself? Like, why not? Like, I'm serious. I'm like, for what? Like, what it like, is it just to be like a good person? Like, don't do that. Don't do that. Like, do you know someone that like might be a better fit for them? Are you willing to sit with someone who like has more experience? Like, are you willing to like take it on like you would take on any other training? Right? Like if you're willing to do that stuff, great. If not, like what's the why? Like, you know, so I think starting with that why is really, 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 really important. And I think a lot of times people bypass that and then everything else they do, however well intentioned, just kind of stumbles and screws up.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Not to be a negative Nelly or anything like that. I'm not saying that. It's just like just to have that like frank and honest conversation with yourself first.
Great answer.
Hello.
And
I was just wondering, I know it's about psychedelics in general, but do you guys see anything specific to the miracle mushroom, I like to call it? Do you see anything special with the Christian tradition of the Eucharist and interpretations of Jesus involving like John Allegro, the sacred mushroom and the cross?
away, throw that book away. I'm so sick of that
No,
book.
I don't like that book either. I don't like that book either. What I think though is like, so Jesus dies and he's resurrected. Mushrooms are decomposers. Jesus bleeds water. It's blue, like the psilocybin mushroom. But yeah, do you guys see any correlation to the biology of the mushroom that is special to Christianity?
I
Have you read
don't.
yeah, go for it.
I just I think mushrooms are what they are, and they are gateways to spiritual experiences. And also, a lot of people don't have spiritual experiences with them. But uh, the 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 connection, I would say, is just that where psychedelics and Christianity or any other religion intersect is at the spiritual experience itself. And however that spiritual experience comes about, um, I think is the important thing to try the weird linguistic and thought trickery that Allegra does for the mushroom stuff and Jesus just seems really
I shouldn't have brought that guy up.
it's really bizarre.
That was
And
just an example.
yeah, and
Uh,
I mean, there's Brian Mirarescu's book about, the possible psychoactive substances in the early Eucharist and that kind of thing. I think that's probably likely. I don't know if it's necessary, but what I would say is that when Christianity was spreading, it had to provide an experience that was equal to or greater than the experience of the indigenous religion that was already present in order to overcome it. It didn't just overcome those things with power. So, I mean, there was something about Christianity and the experience of Christianity that was greater than the experience that was being had in some of those places before Christianity was overtaken by forces of power. And so, what was that experience? And I think that experience, whether it was facilitated by psychedelics or any other psychoactive substance, or a spontaneous spiritual experience, I think kind of becomes, it's more about what was the experience rather than how the experience came about. That's kind of my take on what you're asking there, I think. So
I mean, I'm with you 110%. I definitely think you should read The Immortality Key if you haven't read it. But I also think in terms, what, you didn't like it?
I mean, I just don't think it comes before mushrooms. He's talking about ergot, right?
Right, but here's the thing, like when you're talking about mushrooms, you're talking about a fruiting body, right? Think
Right.
about all the fungus that is present in grain, all the fungus that can be like held on spore molds that can be held on the skins of grapes and barley. So
Do you
between the
disagree with Terrence McKenna then?
no,
Oh,
no, no, don't date. But even up into the 50s, I mean, have a good friend. He's an older German dude, and he would say like, no, there would be times when, like, this is back when they still had like local bakeries. They'd be like, no, you can't eat that bread this week because it'll make you go crazy, right? So these altered states of consciousness, again, these were not. I don't believe that these are like insane peak experiences that people were having on a regular basis. I think there was a more general altered state of consciousness that existed in part because of starvation, in part because of intense meditation, and in part because food storage wasn't what it is today. So you could take a sip of wine and be like, oh, great, this is one of those. All right, now I'm having this experience, right? Or, you can have some toast and say, wrong baker this week, right? And so these altered states of consciousness inform how we think about the world, not just religion, but how the old an old way to protect your home was to take a donkey skull and make a sign that says Hercules lives here and bang it on your freaking door. Well, if you're freaking high on some weird bread and you see that sign, you're like, oh shit, okay, my bad, right? So our altered states of consciousness informed how we approach the world. And then of course, if that's your baseline, you're going to need a more intense experience in order for it to be something foundational to your religion. That doesn't necessarily have to be a fruiting body. It can still be lots of different ways of getting altered states of consciousness. I don't remember the name of the book. I teach it. It is somewhere around here. It's about the history of Italy, like Bread of the Divine, Bread of the Divine. That like this guy makes an argument that for about 400 years, like the mass population of Italy was in some form of psychedelic trance, either because of starvation, poor water quality, or he says the consumption of human flesh. So, it doesn't just have to be a mushroom. It doesn't just have to be like a penis, albino penis envy that somebody eats and never lives experience.
I just don't really. So you're basically saying that altered states brought about through natural means came before psychedelic ingestion? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that psychedelic ingestion is a 1950s concept. And if you look at the history of the human experience when it comes to the not normal, and we see most of that in religion, you'll find altered states of consciousness through lots of different means, not just the ingestion of
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess I'm just confused. I thought that you would have thought like the Terrence McKenna thing more, I guess, but that's why I asked. No? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think drumming and all that is great, and like I think it starts with the drum, honestly. I mean, yeah.
I mean, there's movement, right? Like there's
Yeah.
fasting, there's isolation, there's all these different ways that we have tapped into, deeper reservoirs of self, you know. Doug Lyman is back, it seems.
Oh, if I could just interject there for John, there was a really interesting line in the Bible that a friend of mine pointed out to me. Mark Airy, he's a biblical scholar. He's like, there's a line in the Bible about Jesus says, the fields are white and ready for the harvest. Well, what's white on the field? That's ergot, that's fungus, that's the fields of overrotted, right? They're too ripe, but that's when you would harvest the field to make a psychedelic compound. So maybe that doesn't prove anything, but I'm not sure that it's just another thing to think about, that maybe that isn't so far-fetched that ergot would be used over mushrooms, but it's kind of whatever got them there.
I appreciate that. Um, I will definitely think about that more and look into it. I guess I just think of the mushrooms, their biology as the decomposers and the like they communicate between trees and all this like very complex stuff that keeps the forests alive. And like the ayahuasqueros say that the psilocybin mushroom told them how to make ayahuasca. Like stuff like that. I don't know. To me, I disagree with, but I'll look into your guys' stuff a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Seth and Aize, any final thoughts for us before we go? We're almost at 1:30 Eastern.
This has been great. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I really enjoyed talking with Aize, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Yes, you're always fun to talk to. I'm looking for the name of that book, which I thought I had. Right, but I'll send it to you guys and you can share it with everybody as soon as I get it right.
Excellent. And we'll be sending out a recording of this conversation as well. And also, if you do have those recommendations for additional speakers or topics that you'd like to cover in 2024, please do fill out that form. It's great to get together with this community. I know a lot of different people don't have these kind of spaces locally to talk about the intersection of Christianity and psychedelics. So we're glad to provide these spaces digitally and connect with you all.
Wait, I found it.
What's it called?
Bread of Heaven.
Bread of Heaven. Okay, good. Great title.
Sorry, Bread of Dreams. Bread of Dreams. Bread of Dreams.
Bread of Dreams. Okay. Quick point that there's an event today. It's late notice. I just found out yesterday from the Cleveland Clinic with Jamie Clark Souls, who's with Seth and me. She teaches at Perkins at SMU and a fantastic teacher and lecturer, and it's free. It's just an online. The link's there. If you can do it at 5 Eastern, it would well be worth your time. Psychedelics and soul care is what she's talking about today.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.